Okay, welcome to today's session, all about preparing your files to migrate to Microsoft 365. My name is Dougie Wood. I'm a solutions architect at Valto. I've specialised in document solutions for the past 10 years, and more recently, in the past couple of years, I've been focusing on digital transformation with things like Power Platform, which is using products such as Power Apps and Power Automate to deliver mobile applications. I lead the development team here at Valto, and I get involved with projects end to end, so I get to see a real good sort of life cycle about how all of our kind of projects work. In today's session, we'll be covering all the key topics for preparing your files to migrate to Microsoft 365. We only have a short session today of 30 minutes, so we're going to boil down all the useful kind of insights that you need to take away with you today. So roughly the agenda today is going to be talking about, first off, I'm going to look at building an intranet with Microsoft 365. So the core products which go into kind of where you're going to be storing your documents and building kind of intranet with SharePoint and Teams. Then we're going to look at the different approaches to migration. So not one size fits all for everybody's migration, and there are different sort of pros and cons from different approaches. So we're going to look at some of those. We're going to look at creating a plan. So the sort of types of documentation that you might need when you're sort of getting started with your migration project, and just making sure that everything stays on track. We're going to be talking about cleansing your files and folders, so what you need to be aware of as you're kind of going through that, and really there's no time like the present to start doing that. If you're already considering migrating your files into Microsoft 365, then start cleansing your folders today. Then we're going to be talking about some thresholds and considerations. So generally, there's a few things you need to be aware of if you're new to things like SharePoint. So there's a couple of gotchas that you just need to be aware of as well. And again, we'll just go through some of them. We're going to talk a bit about the equipment and tools that you'll need for your migration, as well as I say, because we're going to be boiling down this session to 30 minutes, there's going to be some 10 insider tips to sort of take away from today's session to make sure that you're well on your way for your migrational path. Also, these slides are available afterwards. If you'd like a copy, please feel free to email me afterwards and I can send you a copy. But we've got some useful resources in there for links to certain tools, information about sort of migrations and things like that along the way. Also, at the very end, there'll be some time for Q&A. We might run over a little bit, but I'll hopefully be able to answer everybody's questions. So, first thing, building an intranet with Microsoft 365. So, the core kind of product which is going to provide you a kind of an interface, a portal into your kind of documents is going to be SharePoint. Now, a lot of people, when they think about SharePoint, they just think of this boring old place where they had documents stored and it was never really properly used. Now, with modern SharePoint and SharePoint Online, you can have a really rich kind of interface. So, for example, here we've got the SharePoint homepage where we can have sort of things like news being pulled through and sliders, video links, countdown timers, weather, and it's a much richer experience than just a sort of pile of documents. So considering that along the way and choosing this as an opportunity to create a nice interactive portal is going to really sort of add some value. Before migrating, you need to consider your intranet structure. So we're going to talk a bit more about the different SharePoint sites. Before we talk about the actual migration elements, I just want to talk about different types of SharePoint sites, as there's not just one, there's a couple of different options. And considering how all of that comes together to form your overall intranet is going to be really vital. So there's three main kind of SharePoint sites which are important to understand. One which is a hub site, one is a communication site, and the other is a team site, which a lot of people are familiar with. Microsoft Teams, which is essentially a SharePoint team site, which is also attached to an Office 365 group. But you can just have a team SharePoint site as well. But we'll talk a bit more about that as we kind of move through. So the first thing is SharePoint Hub Site. So what is a hub site? So essentially the hub site is like your home page of your overall kind of intranet. And this as well is sometimes the place where you might store kind of information which is relevant to everybody as well. So things like policies, procedures, marketing materials, things like that, which a lot of people want to be able to easily access. The first key thing, though, which is a massive difference when using hub sites compared to previously, if you're coming from a background where you're looking at migrating an old version of SharePoint into SharePoint Online, You'll be familiar with this kind of concept of sub-sites. So this is what's kind of shown here, where we've got one site collection and we've got multiple sub-sites which sit underneath it. Now, this is a totally different approach now with hub sites, where actually no longer are sub-sites are locked in place under a rigid kind of hierarchy. Now, hub sites essentially are a centralized place which link multiple sites together. So you might have an IT site and you might have a finance site, and they all link to that particular hub site. Now, for most small, medium-sized businesses, one hub site, one homepage is adequate. That's more than enough than you're ever going to need. However, in larger organizations and enterprises, you might end up having multiple. So you might have ones for geographic locations or sort of high-level business functions, or if you're part of a group and actually you've got 3 or 4 different companies in one, you might have a hub site per company in that case. And those different teams and SharePoint sites, then like finance and IT, might associate to those different hub sites. But however, say for example, there was a reorg sort of shuffle, and now say finance sat under a different kind of function, which was your hub site. It's easy to reallocate that site to a different hub site, whereas previously with a sub site, there was no way of reallocating a sub-site to a different sort of top-level site. So it was a really big sort of job to do that. Hub sites also provide things like inheritance as well. So, for example, you can set all your permissions at your hub site, and then the other sites can inherit from that. You can set your branding, your colors and logos and things like that from your hub site, and the other sites will inherit that as well. You can set your hub navigation, and we'll take a little look at hub navigation as we look at a screenshot on the next slide. But essentially, you can provide a single kind of navigational element, which can then be inherited by all of your other kind of teams and SharePoint sites throughout as well. Provides a nice, consistent navigation throughout your intranet. It also can provide roll-ups, so you've got things like you can roll up news articles from the different sites, documents, and general activity about what people have been up to, and presenting a nice kind of roll-up to everybody on the homepage of your hub site. So this is what a typical kind of hub site would look like. You've got things like news articles across the top. You can also see this is where we've got hub navigation, which I was saying is consistent throughout the intranet. So if I went then say the IT site, the navigation across the top would remain exactly the same. You can have things like embeds of PDFs, documents, but this could easily as well just be a Power BI chart, which is embedded directly into the page. You've got things like events, as well as quick links, news articles, and key contacts from people as well. So it really does provide that kind of nice kind of portal interface through using a hub site. The next type of site is a team site. So everyone was probably going to be familiar with Microsoft Teams at this point, but what they might not necessarily know is that Microsoft Teams also have a corresponding SharePoint site in the background, and that's where it stores its files. So essentially, your SharePoint team sites can be associated to Microsoft Teams, but they don't have to be either. They can just be standalone SharePoint team sites as well. They're used for storage of day-to-day kind of files of that sort of team or department, in this case, for example, the sales team here, and general sort of collaboration with the team. You can have news articles and pages, maybe some like wiki articles, frequent asked questions, things like that, and everything your team kind of needs all under one roof. Team sites have their own navigation across the left-hand page, and you actually know it's a team site. And we're going to talk about another type of template called a communication site next. But you know that this is a team site because the navigation is on the left-hand side. And usually for team sites, you would have one per department. So you'd have one for, say, marketing team, one for sales team, one for IT team, and so on. We might have them per project, per client, per supplier, and you can split it out in a couple of different ways. This is just what it would look like inside of a Microsoft team, where you can see here we've embedded our SharePoint team site, our homepage with the news and the leadership directly inside of our Microsoft team as well. So you can get everything all under one kind of roof. Then we've got a SharePoint communication site. Now, for anybody who's coming from an old kind of legacy SharePoint, you might have heard of things like publishing sites, which are essentially a way of communicating information to the wider organization. It can provide a single source of truth, so essentially a centralized place where people can go to get certain information. So you might have a site dedicated to your policies where people can go through, navigate and find HR policies or things like that, or maybe things like forms, like or proposal templates, marketing materials, approved kind of imagery and things like that. Technically, it's things that you want to be able to get people to access easily from your SharePoint portal. Now, communication sites are not associated in any way with Microsoft Teams, although sometimes they are departments which are responsible for the communication sites. So say, for example, you might have a finance team, which the finance team, for example, a lot of departments offer services to the wider organization. So, for example, finance offers expense forms to the wider organization. Now, they don't necessarily want everybody to come inside of their team site to be able to get that. They want to provide a nice sort of publishing kind of area, a communication site where they can provide links to the latest expense forms, or if it's HR, it might be policy information. If it's IT, it might be raising a support desk kind of tickets, frequent asked questions about technical things, and so on. Now, they can then manage these communication sites without anyone having to come into their team sites, which are used for their day-to-day kind of document management. So this is what maybe a sort of communication site could look like. So again, we've got news articles, events. In this case, it's for a HR site. So there might be quick links to things like employee handbooks, recruitment processes, interview materials for managers and things like that, and make it nice and easy for everyone to find all of those materials. Now, not necessarily related to an intranet, but what's also worth considering as part of this overall plan, when you're thinking about how many hub sites you need to create, how many team sites you need to create, how many communication sites you need to create, also consider OneDrive. Now, OneDrive is a personal storage area for your employees. Now, it's really important that you think about using this because every employee gets up to 1 terabyte of storage space within their own OneDrive inside of Office 365. Now, when you think about that, that's a lot of storage space than what a lot of people are used to using. And if you think about it, on average, actually, a lot of people, their Microsoft 365 overall storage space for SharePoint and Teams and things like that combined is only a few, like maybe 2-3 terabytes, something like that, on average for a small, medium-sized business. And then when you compare that to, you might have, say, 50 employees, and that's then 50 terabytes of kind of storage space. So if you've got a kind of file server at the moment where you've got, say, like a Mac drive or something which has got a folder per employee, you should be looking at migrating that into OneDrive, not into SharePoint or Microsoft kind of Teams. Also, a little sort of tip as well is if you're looking at part of your migration that you've got a lot of data left over, and say in certain circumstances where you might have a terabyte of data left over that you want to hang on to for a couple of years, no one's really going to be accessing it though. Potentially you could use like a service account, like if you've got an account, just sort of a general kind of admin or an IT admin account for Office 365, that will also have a terabyte of storage space inside of it as well. So it's worth kind of using that and maybe migrating into there. And again, you've got it stored, you've got it backed up inside of your OneDrive space, but you're not necessarily using up your kind of SharePoint and Team kind of overall storage threshold. You can also share documents from your from your OneDrive, so you can move them from from OneDrive into SharePoint or Teams, or you can choose to share outwards as well. So OneDrive typically only the user themselves has access to those files and folders, but you can choose to share those out as well. It's not rigid, it's not locked down. And it can also be used for opening up external sharing as well. So it's quite often to mitigate potential documents falling into the wrong hands. Rather than opening up a SharePoint site or a Microsoft Team to an external party, you could potentially open up OneDrives to external party. So it's only certain employees' files would then be sort of being shared externally. And that means that you don't have to use things like Dropbox or Google Drive or Quick Share or any of these different things which you could be like external sharing files outwards. You've then got that governance, that control, that security over the documents that you know is under your IT policy within inside of OneDrive, and cutting out all these third-party places that people tend to use because they don't have in-house kind of external sharing products. So that brings on to the different types of migration. So as I said before, there's plenty of different ways that you can look at sort of migrating your documents, and not one size fits all. And I've tried to break these out into sort of high level kind of types of migration, but you might think that certain elements of it might work in certain scenarios for you and not in other scenarios. So you might pick and choose some of the kind of options and sort of pros and cons from them. So the first is about a lift and shift. Now, I call this a lift and shift because it's essentially migrating everything as it is from a current location, either from an old kind of SharePoint or maybe from a file server directly into SharePoint Online and Microsoft Teams without really considering the structure or cleansing the data or anything like that. So the pros of that is obviously it's quick. It's something that you can turn around very quickly, and there's no input from your kind of users. It's not reliant on anybody to cleanse any documents or anything like that. The cons of it are is it's potentially is migrating redundant files, so you're not actually sort of making things efficient or streamlining anything, and there's no opportunities to improve. So times move on, and there might be better ways of structuring your files and folders. So a tip here is only attempt this if you either have very efficient folder structures. So maybe you've only recently sort of set something up on a different sort of product like like on Dropbox, and you're looking just to move that across, and you've already gone through the cleansing process and to set everything up, or you physically don't have any choice. So maybe you've got a critical time limit, such as failing hardware or software licenses, which needs to be renewed. So a couple of years ago, I worked with an organization where their file server just completely kind of died, blew up, and they could not use it. So we had to look at restoring that, putting everything back onto kind of hard drives, which we could then migrate up into SharePoint. Now, that basically meant there was no time for cleansing, there was no time for sort of doing anything because they couldn't access their files. So in that scenario, the lift and shift approach worked. However, it doesn't necessarily fit everyone's scenario. The other option is a users as and when. So I kind of call it a user as and when, because essentially what you're doing is potentially you're setting up some SharePoint sites, some SharePoint teams, but you're letting users move files manually across into the new SharePoint teams themselves. So you're not looking at sort of migrating it, you are letting the users do that. Now, the pros of that is you're getting the users using the products much quicker, and they're learning by doing, they're actually getting hands-on and physically doing something. The cons are the time required from all the staff. So it means that you're putting a lot of the onus on the staff to actually move everything across. And you can end up with duplication. So you can incentivize this a little bit by putting the old, say, file server into read-only mode to make sure that people are moving things across. But you can still end up with duplications where I could move a file across and my colleague isn't aware of that and he moves it across as well. So you can still end up with duplications. Also, you're allowing the window to be open for kind of organic growth of file and folder structures, which can often end up being very messy and not really all that well organized to start with anyway. So tips for this is only attempt if you want to adopt Microsoft 365 very quickly, but do not have any particular reason to decommission your old document storage, say within 12 months, for example. It's also quite a good option if you're looking to save money on an overall migration. So obviously in this scenario, you don't need any migration tools. You don't need to sort of pay anybody else to do the migration for you. And it's saving costs on doing it in that kind of way. And then the third option, which is usually our more preferred option, is what I refer to as a managed new structure approach, which is essentially carefully planning your new structure that represents the key kind of business functions and teams within your organization, and then manage that migration with sort of either your IT team will sort of manage this, or a third party, for example, Valto, could potentially manage that for you as well. So there's some pros behind this. So there's more structure, it's more efficient, and less overall impact on end users, and the opportunity to kind of refresh old ways of working. So you can look at this and think, actually, we can make this a lot more efficient. There's ways we can break this out. So we've got new teams, new departments. We can split it out and make it reflect more the way that the organization is structured. The cons of it are is it requires more time to plan. So this is not something that's going to happen overnight. Typically managed kind of sort of structures, they will take a couple of months from sort of start to end to actually manage that kind of process through. But it is our preferred kind of method. Next, we're looking at creating a plan. So how do you actually create a plan? So the first thing you want to do is gather your stakeholders. So that's your IT department, your heads of department and super users to discuss all those different things, like the different types of migrations and what is going to be the best approach, and understanding as well from a resourcing perspective who's going to be available for cleansing documents and when they can complete those things by. The next thing, once you've chosen your kind of stakeholders and your migrational type, then engage, and obviously this is optional, but engage a Microsoft partner. So for example, Valto offer fully managed migration services, or we can provide ad hoc support services to bridge knowledge gaps. So maybe you have an IT department that just needs a little bit of additional support or training on how to use some of the migrational tools so that they can actually get hands-on and do that themselves. Next, you want to create a project plan and document who will need to do what by when. So this is roughly on the right hand side what I've got here, a rough project plan to break out into different phases: the initiation, the kickoff, building your new SharePoint kind of portals, infrastructure, creating the kind of teams, then sort of doing a bit of testing and making sure people are signing off and saying, yeah, this is exactly how we want the new structure to be. Then you'll be looking kind of migrating. So you'll probably do a seed migration first, which is what I refer to, basically doing a bulk move. So once everyone's cleansed all of their documents and they've cleansed it and signed off, say, yeah, we're happy with the way these sort of files and folders are, we're now going to look at moving this across as one big bulk to get it across, get everyone happy with it. Once every sort of team department signed off to say, yeah, we're good to go with that, that's when you plan in the go live date, which essentially you would then do a sort of incremental migration, which is usually a lot quicker. Obviously, some people ask how long does a migration take, which is always a question of how long is a piece of string. But typically, once you've done your bulk kind of migration, most small, medium-sized businesses, when they're moving stuff across to go live, you can usually set it running sort of on a Friday afternoon, say at 5 o'clock, and then on Monday mornings you'll go live when you put the old file server into read-only mode, and everyone starts using it as of sort of 9 o'clock Monday morning, which we would often align with maybe a bit of training as well, sort of like a refresher. Obviously, you've already done your training, but maybe a refresher session, so everyone's up to speed and sort of making sure they're able to move forward. So once you create your project plan, you'll then need to look at creating a site map spreadsheet. So what I would recommend you do is create something like this at the bottom here, where you can see the team name. So you can see here, I've got HR team, who the owner of the team is. So teams are quite self-governing. So you really want to be looking for owners and super users who are going to be able to manage their team going forward, members and things like that. So we set the members who's going to have access to these team sites, and then we can put in there the current file path. So where does the files currently live? So if you've got a file server, for example, they might live under departments, human resources, and then HR team, for example, and that's where those documents live. And you want to map all that out, because that's going to become really useful when you come to use your migrational tool to see exactly which file paths are going to map to which areas. And you can also then have other columns to say whether or not the documents have been cleansed and signed off by the head of department and things like that, to keep track of where each department is up to. The next step would be to create your kind of intranet and engaging relevant parties such as your comms team. So it's a great opportunity to bring in things like branded imagery and colors and things like that, and you want to get that portal looking right. Cleansing your documents, so again, discuss further, so I'm going to discuss further on the next slide, but the cleansing the documents is really important, and really want to be starting that as soon as possible. From the point you basically got your stakeholders together, you want to be trying to get people cleansing documents as soon as possible, because from a migration perspective, it's the cleansing the documents which is going to take the most amount of time. So when you're cleansing your folders, what do you need to be thinking about? So what I would refer to as creating a one-to-one folder kind of structure. So, as for example, you would get an IT folder for your IT team. So if you look back on this screen, you can see here, for example, in this map, I've got a HR team. And I've got one file path. So what we're kind of encouraging the HR team to do is create a folder called HR team within their human resource folder, and then move everything into here as if this is going to be the team. So new folder structure, moving the files in across into there, and then signing it off. I've seen it before where people have chosen not to do this, where they've not wanted to have just one folder that moves into their team, and they've provided kind of a spreadsheet which has kind of got 10 folders that need to go into that one team. However, the more kind of file paths you have, the higher the risks are that something is going to go wrong. Either there's a folder that's been missed, or someone's not put a file inside of that folder, or also when it comes around to using your migrational tool, the more file paths you have to migrate, technically, the higher the odds are that one of those could potentially fail, and then you've got an issue to kind of try and resolve. So once you've got that kind of your folder, say IT team, ready to move across, you only store things in there that you want to move across into that team. You want to delete all redundant files, or just not include the files that you want to move into the team into that new folder. And less files means it's going to be a quicker migration. So you don't want to be moving anything that you don't need. As the less data overall, it's going to be a lot quicker. Plan to move any personal folders into OneDrive. So like I was talking about OneDrive before, don't plan on moving them into Teams. Don't plan on moving them into SharePoint. Plan on moving them into specific OneDrive areas. And you want to ideally remove any special characters. Now, nowadays, most of the migrational tools can cope with special characters, but there's no harm actually just removing them, and then you know for certain that you're not going to run into any issues when you're kind of looking at migrating. You want to plan, so certain teams, say for example like finance, they might have restricted folders. So you might have a finance team and you might have a folder that lives within inside of there called restricted finance or payroll or something like that, which maybe only 2 of the 10 finance team members have access to. And in those scenarios, you want to be planning those restricted folders to not be folders when they come across into your new SharePoint and Teams intranet. You want to be planning those to be restricted channels, private channels within inside of your team. And that means not only you get that area for sort of restricted files and private files, but you also get a private chat to go along with that as well. So if there's any conversations that need to happen around kind of say payroll, you can have those conversations in one place rather than trying to then break the conversations out into a sort of private chat. The other thing to be aware of is linked files will need to be manually updated once they're migrated. So say, for example, you've got a finance team which has got multiple Excel files, which are say forecasting or something like that, which are linking to other multiple Excel files. When they get migrated, those Excel sort of linked pathways are obviously going to still be still linking to old locations, so old file server. So they need to be manually updated. Now, that's something that's key and critical to actually your plan process, is to identify those key documents and making the department who is responsible aware of them so they can plan in advance. Now, you can get tools as well which can help with that and update those links, but again, they're quite pricey. So most people opt to just manually doing it themselves. You want to keep your subfolders as low as possible. So you've probably all heard this kind of theory before, that people don't want to click more than 3 times to be able to actually access something. So keep them as low as possible. We've also got some the question about folders versus metadata tags. So in this scenario, we can see most people have folders like forms, policies, and user guides. But you can also add metadata tags inside of SharePoint. So you can then tag your documents with certain things, which helps with search as well as filtering and sorting. And we can also then group by, say, form policy, which acts just like folders. However, metadata tags are lost if you then try and access the documents through File Explorer. So if you sync your files and then access them through File Explorer, you'll find that actually they don't appear. You've just got this big dumping ground of documents. So my advice would be to try and find a sweet spot between actually having a small amount of folders, maybe 2-3 folders deep, and then having some additional tags on top of that to provide a richer kind of search and filtering service afterwards. Some other kind of considerations. So inside the SharePoint library can hold up to 30 million files. However, document libraries can only ever show you up to 5,000 files at one point in time. So you need to consider, if you've got large documents, a lot of documents in one sort of team, how are you going to then split that out? So you might have multiple document libraries to get around that, or you need to think about how you can have filters on your documents. So you are returning less than 5,000 files at any point in time. So that can be done. Maybe you could do it like have a view to only show documents that have been created, uploaded in the last 12 months or something like that. And then you could have them split by year or any other type of category to sort of break that down. You've also got limitations on the file path, and that must not exceed 255 characters. And in fact, actually, to be safe, I would always say to people, don't exceed 200. So a file path is like this down here. So you can see on a file server, my holidays document is actually this length here. Now, without adding any more files or folders to this, once this is transferred into SharePoint, you can see that the overall file path has got a lot longer because it's got the SharePoint name, it's got the SharePoint site name, the library name, the folder name, and then where it actually sits. So actually considering the overall file path length, it's not necessarily how many folders you have, it's actually how many characters it comes down to inside this overall file path. Now, what I would suggest is that you look at this and make sure that you don't exceed 200, because actually it's not SharePoint, it's the actual the software products like Excel, Word, they all have their own limitations. So I think Word is 255, whereas Excel is actually 213. So you can run into a lot of issues. Now, you can do things like running a PowerShell script, which can extract all of the files and then work out which ones are high risk because they're exceeding that file path length, and then you can then go in and sort of update those manually to remove maybe folders or shorten file names. Another sort of tip, something to sort of consider, is the ability to lock down who can create SharePoint sites and create teams. Now, by default, anyone can create SharePoint sites, anyone can create Microsoft Teams, so it can really become a runaway train. Now, with a little bit of PowerShell, you can actually update this so only certain people in a security group, like the IT team, for example, can create Teams and SharePoint sites to stop it from becoming a runaway train. Also, we've developed recently a Power App for Teams requests. So you can implement this inside of Microsoft Teams where people can go in and they can enter the name of the team that they would like to create. That can then go off to, say, the IT team or a relevant person to say yes or no, to approve or reject it. And that can automate the process of actually creating the team. This is just a little example of a tool that I've provided a link to in the useful resources, which will count your characters. So if you thought there was a suspicious looking file that was too long, you can paste in the file path into here and it'll tell you how many characters it actually is. So for equipment, really what you're going to need is a laptop or a virtual machine, which has got some good processing power and some available memory. It should have access to all the files and folders that you need to be able to migrate and be able to be left on for days at a time. It needs to have a good, fast internet connection. And also, what I would recommend is don't use migration tools on the actual file server itself, because there's a risk that it could potentially end up crashing. Now, I've actually seen this before with a project a couple of years ago where this was done, and they opted to actually install the migrational tools on their file server, and because of such a heavy load, it actually took the file server off. It was a creaking old bit of hardware and it went offline, and because we were doing a live migration, it was over a weekend, it meant then the client had to go into the office on a weekend to restart the server, and nobody wants to be going into the office on a Saturday morning. So ideally you want it to be on a machine which you can remotely reboot, and it's not going to be the end of the world if it was to go down. There are some third-party migration tools, so there's things like ShareGate, AvePoint, MetaLogix, and they're all really great tools for advanced migrations. And if you're going to be doing the migration yourself, I would advise you look at one of these tools. I quite like ShareGate. It's got a really nice kind of user interface. However, the downside is they're very expensive. You're not going to get a cheap sort of migrational tool that's going to do everything. Roughly, you're looking about somewhere between £3,000 to £6,000 for a migrational tool, and it depends on the package, but yeah, it's not going to be cheap. There is a free migration tool from Microsoft, which is quite good for basic kind of things. It will handle basic permission things. It can go direct into Teams and OneDrive, and it is quite good. However, if you're looking at doing it yourself, you'd probably want to sort of consider sort of using a third-party kind of migrational tool. Now, the cost of the migrations, like I was saying, 3,000, 6,000, that could potentially end up being a similar sort of price you would pay for a sort of Microsoft partner to actually do the migrations yourself. So it's a pros and cons for the different kind of options there, but they are quite pricey. So really quick now, because obviously we're running out of time a little bit, but 10 useful tips. So based on years of experience being part of many different approaches, I've got some 10 top tips for you. So the first is adequate planning. Make sure that you're planning. Use those kind of templates that we've got in the useful tips area, the useful resources, to make sure you're planning properly. You want to investigate and understand your existing content and just make sure that essentially you know essentially what is and what isn't important when you're migrating. And if you're only going to be migrating a small amount of data and leaving the rest of the users, then you want to know exactly what is important to migrate and what can stay behind. You need to create new structures as it's a chance to improve. So don't just use your existing kind of structures. Look at how you can align this to your organization and look at the way your business kind of functions work. Agree on migration approach and timelines. So a lot of people jump straight into this without even thinking about what's the approach they're going to take and what are the timelines. You want to set a budget. So think about the tools you're going to need, the resources you're going to need, the training that you're going to need. So you might need some additional training for end users, but as well as that, your super users and even your IT department may need some training for using things like the migrational tools and how to set up Microsoft Teams. Sourcing professional training. So as I said, Valto can provide training courses specifically tailored for advanced things like IT and migrations, as well as super users and end users as well. You want to be able to commit internal resource to this. So this is something that we see people fall down on quite a lot, is that they've not considered how much internal resource they're going to need from the IT department, from heads of department, as well as pilot users as well. And generally, if you're looking at people cleansing their data, how much time it's going to take for them to do that and factor that in from an early stage. And then also ongoing support. So from your IT department, are they comfortable with supporting SharePoint? Are they comfortable supporting Microsoft Teams? Do they need additional training? Or can you rely on a Microsoft partner such as Valto to provide that ongoing kind of support? Also considering a migration partner. So looking at using a Microsoft partner such as Valto for migrations can make it a lot easier. It's secure, it's efficient, and it's similar cost to actually using one of those sort of migrational tools as well. It's not as expensive as using those kind of tools. So here's some useful resources. So I'll let you kind of go through these in your own time. But essentially, there's a link here for the migrational tool, a free migrational tool to take a look at that. Some links to some about online kind of SharePoint Online limitations, some information about hub sites, as well as the two documents I showed you earlier on. Down here, so the migrational plan and the sitemap, as well as a link to that tool online, which will help you count your file path characters as well. So we offer workshops, so we can deliver remote workshops on today's kind of topics to plan your migration and help you kind of deliver this. We also offer various other workshops around Teams adoption, Microsoft 365 Modern Workplace, SharePoint intranets, SharePoint migrations, and Power Apps as well. Typically, what we include as part of the SharePoint workshop is reviewing your current files and folders and ways of working. We look at how we can set up a SharePoint modern intranet with a nice portal interface and working with anybody internally or comms team for creating something like that. We look at Microsoft Teams and how that's best going to be rolled out and configured for your organization. We document all of our key findings as we kind of go through and create a site map so we know exactly what sites we're going to be creating, what teams are going to be creating, and what is going to be migrated into different areas. We look at the training requirements. So what type of training will you need? Will you need advanced IT kind of training if you're looking at doing the migration yourself? Or will you need super user training so that super users can go to their departments and support their guys internally? Following that, we then write up a specification and recommendations based on that, which has a fixed price project following that as well. So we say exactly, this is what we recommend, and this is exactly how much it's going to cost. Now, a workshop is only $850 for a remote workshop, and that includes the write-up, the specification, and the fixed price project as well. Okay, cool. I'm just going to jump over now and just look to see if there's any questions from anybody. So one question there, how easy is it for people to update SharePoint homepages themselves? So very easy, actually. It's very easy for people to update themselves. And we would usually train like a comms department, something like that, how to update them. It's once you know how, it's quite simplistic, kind of drag and drop, a little bit like a website builder, like kind of One-on-One, Weebly, or WordPress, for example. So it's quite easy to pick that up over a period of time. Question there about can OneDrive storage be reallocated? Unfortunately not. So OneDrive, although everybody gets a terabyte of storage space within inside of OneDrive, it is only for their use. It cannot be transferred to any other employee, nor can it actually be sort of transferred to Microsoft Teams or SharePoint. Okay, guys, just conscious of time. If you do have any other questions, so I've not been able to get around to all the questions, please do feel free to contact me. You can contact me at dougie@valto.co.uk, and I'll answer any questions you've got regarding SharePoint migrations or anything to do with Microsoft 365. We've done a lot of work for some some big names. So we've got some good clients we've done some migrational work for. And if you'd like to kind of speak to us about this, please feel free to get in contact with us at any time. Okay, thank you very much for your time, guys. Bye-bye.